The dining hall of Galactic Trade Station Nexus 7 was always crowded during the midday cycle. And today was no different from any other day on this massive orbital hub, where hundreds of alien species came together to conduct business and diplomacy. Jack Morrison walked through the sliding doors with a thermal container tucked under his arm and a hopeful smile on his face, ready for another meal among the stars, though he already knew how this would likely end, just like every other time before this one. He was a human trade negotiator in his mid-30s, working as a cultural liaison for Earth's merchant fleet, and he had been stationed on Nexus 7 for nearly 2 years now, learning the customs and habits of dozens of alien species while trying to represent humanity's interests in the wider galaxy. The dining hall stretched out before him like a small city, with hundreds of tables arranged in clusters and food dispensers from 60 different worlds lining the walls, serving everything from nutrient paste to live protein cubes to whatever else the galaxy's diverse inhabitants preferred to consume. Jack scanned the room for an empty spot and found one near the center of the hall, a small table with 4 seats that nobody seemed to be using at the moment. He made his way through the crowd, passing Velthrani diplomats with their tall, pale bodies and sensitive facial tendrils, Korath merchants clicking their insectoid mandibles as they discussed trade agreements, and Drellian officers in their crisp gray uniforms who nodded politely as he walked by. Reaching the table, Jack set down his container and pulled out a chair, settling into his seat with a quiet sigh of satisfaction, because today he had brought something special. Something that reminded him of home more than anything else in this distant corner of space. His grandmother's chili recipe had been passed down through 4 generations of Morrisons, and Jack had spent his morning off carefully preparing it in his small quarters, using ingredients he had paid extra to have shipped from Earth. He unlatched the thermal container and lifted the lid, and immediately the rich aroma of slow-cooked beef, tomatoes, beans, onions, garlic, cumin, and 3 different types of peppers began to spread through the air around his table. The smell was heaven to Jack, a warm reminder of Sunday dinners with his family back in Texas, of laughter and storytelling and the simple joy of sharing a good meal with people he loved. But the aliens around him did not share his appreciation for this culinary treasure. The first to react was a Velthrani businessman at the next table over, whose facial tendrils suddenly went rigid as the spicy aroma reached his highly sensitive olfactory organs, and his pale blue skin seemed to turn even paler as he stood up so quickly that he nearly knocked over his chair. "What is that smell?" the Velthrani demanded in a strangled voice, already gathering his belongings and backing away from Jack's table like the human had just released some kind of toxic gas into the room. Jack opened his mouth to explain, but before he could say a word, the Velthrani had already fled to the far side of the dining hall, putting as much distance between himself and the chili as physically possible. This reaction triggered a chain of similar responses all around him. A group of Korath merchants at a nearby table began clicking their mandibles in rapid patterns that Jack's translator identified as expressions of alarm and disgust. And within seconds, they too had packed up their meals and relocated to seats far away from the offending human. The Drellian officers who had nodded at him just minutes ago now stood with stiff formality and excused themselves without meeting his eyes, their usually stoic expressions showing clear discomfort as they retreated from the spreading cloud of chili aroma. Jack watched as table after table emptied around him, aliens of all species grabbing their food and their belongings and moving away, with varying degrees of panic and revulsion on their faces. Within 5 minutes, he sat completely alone in a wide, empty circle, with every other being in the dining hall maintaining at least a 15-meter distance from his position, like he had created some kind of invisible force field. He looked down at his grandmother's chili, steam still rising from the container in lazy spirals, and he felt a familiar sadness settle into his chest. This happened every single time he brought food from home. Human cuisine, with its complex spices and strong flavors and chemical compounds that would overwhelm most alien senses, was considered almost dangerous by galactic standards. And most species treated Earth food the way humans might treat radioactive waste. Jack picked up his spoon and began eating alone, savoring each bite even as loneliness crept into the corners of his enjoyment. Because sharing meals had always been one of the most important human traditions, and it hurt to be denied that simple pleasure day after day. He thought about his grandmother, who had always said that good food could bring anyone together. And he wondered what she would think if she could see him now, eating her famous recipe in complete isolation while aliens watched from a safe distance with expressions of fear and confusion. But Jack did not notice that one pair of eyes watching him held something different than the others. Across the hall, a young Marathan named Tella observed the lonely human with intense curiosity rather than disgust or fear. She was a junior researcher from the Marathan Exploration Institute, known throughout the galaxy for their scientific dedication to studying dangerous phenomena. And she had been documenting human behaviors for her thesis on Deathworld species adaptation for nearly 6 months now. Tella had 4 large eyes that could see in multiple spectrums, a slender gray body covered in fine sensory hairs, and a mind that burned with questions that other species were too afraid to ask. She watched Jack eat his strange-smelling food with obvious enjoyment, noting how his facial muscles relaxed and his body language shifted to something her translator called contentment, and she found herself wondering what could possibly make substance that smelled so aggressive to every other species bring such obvious pleasure to this human. Her recording equipment captured everything as she made her decision. While every other alien in the dining hall had chosen to flee from the human and his dangerous meal, Tella would do what Marathans did best. She would investigate, gathering her courage and her scientific instruments. Tella stood up from her distant table and began walking toward the lonely human, ignoring the shocked stares and warning clicks from the other diners who clearly thought she had lost her mind. Jack looked up from his chili as he noticed movement in his direction, and his eyes widened with surprise as he saw the small gray alien approaching his table with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than the usual fear. Maybe today would be different after all. Tella approached the human's table with careful steps, her 4 eyes fixed on both the man and the steaming container of food that had sent every other species in the dining hall running for safety. Jack set down his spoon and watched her come closer, his expression shifting from surprise to cautious hope as he realized this alien was not fleeing but actually moving toward him. "Hello there," Jack said in a friendly voice, not wanting to scare her away with any sudden movements. "Are you lost, or did you actually mean to walk in this direction?" Tella stopped at the edge of his table and tilted her head in a gesture that her species used to show curiosity, her sensory hairs rippling slightly as they detected the complex chemical signatures rising from his meal. "I am exactly where I intended to be," she replied through her translator, her voice coming out as a soft musical tone. "My name is Tella, and I am a researcher from the Marathan Exploration Institute, and I have been studying human behaviors for my academic thesis." Jack's eyebrows rose with genuine interest, because he had heard of the Marathans and their reputation for investigating things that other species considered too dangerous or too strange to approach. "Well, Tella, my name is Jack Morrison, and I have to say you are the first person on this station who has ever walked toward me while I was eating instead of running away," he said with a warm smile. "Would you like to sit down?" Tella hesitated for just a moment, glancing at the empty chairs around the table, then made her decision and settled into the seat across from Jack with her recording equipment placed carefully on the table between them. "I hope you do not mind if I document our interaction," she said, adjusting one of her devices. "Everything I observe will be used only for scientific purposes and academic publication." "Document away," Jack replied with an easy shrug. "I have nothing to hide, and honestly, I'm just happy to have some company for once." Tella activated her recorders and leaned forward slightly, her four eyes blinking in sequence as she studied the container of chili with intense scientific focus. "May I ask what substance you are consuming?" she inquired. "My sensors are detecting over 40 distinct chemical compounds emanating from that container, and at least 12 of them would be classified as irritants or mild toxins by standard galactic safety protocols." Jack could not help but laugh at her description, though he tried to keep it gentle so she would not think he was mocking her. "This is chili," he explained, gesturing at his meal with obvious affection. "It is a traditional dish from my home region on Earth, and it was my grandmother's special recipe that she taught me to make when I was just a boy." "Chili," Tella repeated, testing the word. "And these toxic compounds are intentional ingredients?" "They are not toxic to humans," Jack clarified. "Well, not in these amounts anyway. What you are detecting are probably the spices and peppers that give the dish its flavor." He began pointing at different components visible in the thick reddish mixture. "These are beans, which are a plant protein source. And this is beef, which comes from an earth animal. And these chunks are tomatoes and onions. And the heat you might be sensing comes from several types of peppers mixed with spices like cumin and garlic and paprika." Tella's recording devices hummed as they captured every word and scanned every ingredient he indicated. "You mentioned heat," she said. "Are you referring to temperature or to a sensory effect?" "Both, actually," Jack answered, enjoying the chance to share something about human culture with someone who genuinely wanted to learn. "The dish is served warm, but the peppers also create a burning sensation on the tongue that humans find pleasurable." Tella's four eyes widened with what Jack was learning to recognize as marathon astonishment. "You deliberately consume substances that create pain sensations, and you find this pleasurable?" she asked, her translator struggling slightly with the concept. "It is not exactly pain," Jack tried to explain. "It is more like, well, have you ever done something that was challenging but rewarding at the same time, like climbing a difficult path or solving a hard puzzle?" Tella considered this comparison for a moment before nodding slowly. "I believe I understand," she said. "The sensation provides stimulation that your species interprets as enjoyable rather than harmful." "Exactly," Jack agreed, impressed by how quickly she had grasped the concept. "Humans evolved on a world where we had to eat plants that produced defensive chemicals to protect themselves from being eaten. But instead of avoiding those plants, we learned to enjoy the sensations they created." "Fascinating," Tella breathed, her sensory hairs standing almost straight up with excitement. "I have read that Earth is classified as a death world due to its harsh conditions, but I never considered how that might affect your dietary preferences." Jack nodded and took another bite of his chili, chewing thoughtfully before continuing. "Food is more than just fuel for humans," he said. "It is how we connect with each other, and how we remember our past, and how we show love to the people we care about. This recipe makes me feel close to my grandmother, even though she passed away years ago, and even though I am millions of miles from home." Tella was quiet for a moment, processing this information with the careful attention of a dedicated scientist. "Most species in the galaxy consume nutrition purely for biological necessity," she finally said. "Our foods are optimized for efficiency and safety, and they provide exactly what our bodies need without any additional sensory experiences. The concept of food as emotional connection is, I must admit, quite alien to me." "That seems sad to me," Jack said honestly. "Some of my happiest memories involve sharing meals with people I love." Tella looked at the chili, then at Jack, then back at the chili again. and Jack could almost see the scientific curiosity battling with caution inside her mind. "I find myself wanting to understand this experience more directly," she said slowly, her voice carrying a hint of nervousness. "Would it be possible for me to taste a small sample of your chili?" Jack's expression shifted to concern as he considered her request. "I want to be honest with you, Tella," he said carefully. "This dish is very mild by human standards, but it might be overwhelming for someone who has never experienced spicy food before. I would not want to hurt you." "I appreciate your concern," Tella replied, "but Marathons have a long tradition of investigating dangerous phenomena, and I am prepared to accept reasonable risks in pursuit of knowledge." Jack thought about it for a long moment, then nodded and reached for a clean spoon from his pack. "All right," he said, "but let me prepare the mildest possible portion for you, and please promise me that if you feel any distress, you will tell me immediately so I can help." Tella agreed, and Jack carefully selected a small amount of broth with minimal spice, making sure to avoid any direct pieces of pepper. He passed the spoon to Tella, who accepted it with slightly trembling hands. Around them, other aliens who had been watching from their safe distance now stared with expressions of horror and disbelief, clearly convinced they were about to witness the small Marathon researcher suffer terrible harm. Tella raised the spoon to her mouth, her 4 eyes closing briefly as if in prayer. And then she tasted human food for the very first time. The moment the chili touched Tella's tongue, her entire body went completely still. Her 4 eyes snapped wide open, staring at nothing, and her sensory hairs stood up so straight that they almost vibrated with the intensity of whatever she was experiencing. Jack leaned forward with deep concern, ready to call for medical assistance if needed, his hand already reaching toward the emergency communication panel built into the table. "Tella?" he asked urgently. "Tella, can you hear me? Are you okay? Do you need help?" For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, the small Marathon researcher sat frozen in place, the spoon still held in her trembling hand. Then she blinked all 4 eyes in rapid sequence and turned to look at Jack with an expression that his translator struggled to identify. "I have no word for this," Tella finally whispered, her voice filled with something between shock and wonder. "My tongue is experiencing multiple sensations at the same time. There is heat, but also depth, and also something sweet, and also something that I can only describe as comfort." Jack released the breath he had been holding and felt relief wash through his body. "So you are not in pain?" he asked carefully. "No," Tella said, shaking her head slowly. "This is not pain. This is like nothing I've ever experienced in my entire life. May I have more?" She took another tiny bite before Jack could even respond, and this time her eyes closed in what appeared to be genuine pleasure as she let the flavors spread across her tongue. "Remarkable," she murmured between bites. "Absolutely remarkable. The chemical compounds are creating a cascade of sensory responses that my brain is interpreting as highly positive stimuli. I understand now why humans are so attached to their cuisine." Jack watched her with growing amazement and no small amount of happiness, because this was the first time any alien had ever reacted to human food with anything other than fear or disgust. "I told you it was good," he said with a proud smile. "My grandmother would have loved to see this." Tella opened her eyes and looked at him with new respect. "Your grandmother must have been a brilliant chemist to create such a complex sensory experience," she declared. Jack laughed warmly at the compliment. "She was a school teacher, actually, but she would have appreciated you calling her that." Their conversation had not gone unnoticed by the other occupants of the dining hall. A Korath merchant named Chirik had been watching from what he considered a safe distance, his compound eyes fixed on the human and the Marathon with intense curiosity. When he saw that Tella had not collapsed or shown any signs of distress after consuming the human food, his scientific curiosity began to overwhelm his natural caution. The Korath were an insectoid species known throughout the galaxy for their shrewd business sense and their willingness to take calculated risks when profit was involved. And Chirrut found himself calculating the potential value of understanding this strange human custom. He approached the table with careful clicking steps, his mandibles moving in patterns that indicated polite greeting. "Forgive my interruption," Chirrut said, "but I could not help observing that you have consumed the human's food without apparent harm. I am most curious about what you experienced." Tella turned to face the Korath merchant with enthusiasm shining in all four of her eyes. "It is unlike anything in our galactic catalog of nutrition," she explained eagerly. "The human food creates what I can only describe as controlled sensory stimulation. It is challenging but rewarding, strange but deeply satisfying." Chirrut's mandibles clicked in a pattern that Jack's translator identified as thoughtful consideration. "I am intrigued," the Korath admitted. "Perhaps purely for research purposes I might also sample this substance?" Jack looked between the two aliens and felt something warm building in his chest, something that felt like hope. "I would be happy to share," he said, reaching for another clean spoon. "But I should warn you that different species might react differently. Let me prepare something very mild for you as well." He carefully prepared another minimal portion, even more diluted than what he had given Tella, and passed it to the curious merchant. Chirrut accepted the spoon with his upper limbs and brought it to his mouthparts with obvious hesitation. The moment he tasted the chili, his mandibles began clicking in rapid succession, creating a sound that Jack had never heard from a Korath before. "What is happening?" Jack asked Tella with concern. "Is he okay?" Tella consulted her translator and then smiled, or at least made the Marathon equivalent of a smile. "He is laughing," she explained. "That clicking pattern indicates extreme delight. I believe he enjoyed it." Chirrut set down the spoon and stared at Jack with new appreciation in his compound eyes. "Human," he declared, "you may have just introduced me to something that could change galactic commerce forever. This experience is worth more than simple nutrition. It is worth paying extra for." Word began spreading through the dining hall faster than Jack could have imagined. Aliens who had fled from his table were now whispering to each other, pointing at the human and the two beings who had survived tasting his dangerous food. A tall Velthrani with pale blue skin and elaborate robes approached next, and Jack recognized him as Ambassador Soren, a diplomatic representative he had seen at several official functions. "I must confess," Ambassador Soren said in his melodic voice, "I have always considered human cuisine to be one of the most frightening aspects of your species. But watching these two experience your food has awakened a curiosity I did not know I possessed. Would you like to try some?" Jack offered, though he felt nervous about sharing with a Velthrani, since he knew their species had particularly sensitive senses. "I believe I would," the ambassador replied, settling into one of the empty chairs at Jack's increasingly crowded table. Jack prepared the most diluted portion yet, barely more than flavored water with the faintest hint of spice, and handed it to the ambassador with extensive warnings about what to expect. Ambassador Soren tasted it carefully, his facial tendrils rippling as the complex flavors washed over his sensitive receptors. "Extraordinary," he breathed. "It is like a symphony of chemical signals performing a dance across my senses. I had no idea that food could be an art form." More aliens began approaching, forming an actual line at Jack's table, each one eager to experience this strange human custom of eating food that was actually interesting. Jack looked down at his container and realized with growing concern that his supply of chili was rapidly disappearing. "I am sorry, everyone," he announced to the waiting crowd, "but I did not bring enough to share with this many people. I only made enough for my own lunch." The collected aliens expressed obvious disappointment, some having waited nearly half an hour for their turn to taste. But Ambassador Soren raised one slender hand to quiet the crowd. "Then perhaps," he suggested with a diplomatic smile. "We should arrange for you to prepare more. I believe I speak for everyone here when I say that we would very much like to experience human cuisine again." Jack looked around at the diverse faces surrounding him. Aliens of species that had avoided him for years, now looking at him with friendly curiosity and genuine interest. And for the first time since arriving on Nexus 7, he did not feel so alone anymore. The crowd around Jack's table continued to grow even after he announced that his chili had run out. With aliens from at least 15 different species gathered in a circle that would have seemed impossible just an hour before. Chirrut the Korath merchant was already calculating numbers on his personal device, his mandibles clicking with excitement as he worked. "Human Jack," he said, "I represent the Korath Merchant Guild, and we would be willing to cover all transportation costs for ingredients from your homeworld, if you would agree to prepare more of this remarkable food." Ambassador Soren nodded in agreement, his facial tendrils waving in patterns that indicated strong support. The Volfrani diplomatic corps would also contribute to such an endeavor, he added. "I believe this could be an opportunity for genuine cultural exchange between our peoples." A Drellian officer named Commander Vex, who had been one of the first to flee from Jack's table earlier, now stood at the edge of the crowd with an expression that mixed embarrassment with curiosity. "I must admit," she said in her species' typically formal tone, "my crew has been secretly curious about human food for years, but we were always too afraid to ask about it. If you were to prepare more, I believe many Drellians would wish to attend." Jack felt overwhelmed by the sudden attention, having gone from complete isolation to being the center of a multi-species gathering in less than an hour. "I appreciate all of your interest," he said, "but getting ingredients from Earth is expensive and time-consuming, and I am just a trade negotiator. I do not have the authority to organize something this big on my own." "Then perhaps we should find someone who does," suggested a familiar voice from the back of the crowd. The gathered aliens parted to reveal Lucy Brooks, Jack's colleague and Earth's Assistant Trade Commissioner on Nexus 7. She was a woman in her early 40s with sharp eyes and a kind of confident posture that came from years of handling difficult diplomatic situations. Lucy walked up to Jack's table and surveyed the crowd with obvious surprise. "Jack," she said slowly, "would you mind explaining why you are surrounded by 100 aliens who were supposedly terrified of human food this morning?" Jack gave her a helpless shrug and gestured at the empty chili container. "I brought my grandmother's recipe for lunch, and apparently it started some kind of cultural revolution." Lucy listened as Tella and Ambassador Soren and Chirrut all tried to explain what had happened, their voices overlapping with enthusiasm as they described the incredible experience of tasting human cuisine. The Assistant Trade Commissioner's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something that looked very much like opportunity. "You realize what this is, do you not?" Lucy asked Jack quietly. "This is exactly the kind of breakthrough our diplomatic corps has been trying to achieve for years. Human culture has always been viewed with suspicion by the galactic community, but you may have just found a way to change that." She pulled out her communication device and began making calls. "This is Lucy Brooks calling Earth's Trade Council," she announced. "I need emergency authorization for a cultural exchange shipment. Yes, it is urgent. Yes, it involves food. No, I am not joking." While Lucy handled the official arrangements, Jack found himself surrounded by aliens asking questions about human cooking. A young Drellian wanted to know if all human food was spicy, and Jack explained that Earth cuisine varied enormously from region to region, with some dishes being mild and others being intensely flavored. A group of Korath merchants wanted to discuss the business potential of importing human spices, calculating profit margins and market demand with impressive speed. Ambassador Soren was already composing a formal proposal for what he called the first Galactic Culinary Exchange, a diplomatic event that would bring together representatives from multiple species to share food and culture. Tella continued recording everything, her thesis growing more exciting by the minute. After nearly an hour of calls and negotiations, Lucy returned to the group with a satisfied expression. "It is done," she announced. "I have secured authorization for an emergency shipment of cooking supplies from Earth. They should arrive in 3 station days." The crowd cheered, or at least made various species-specific sounds of approval. "But we will need help," Lucy continued. "Jack cannot cook for hundreds of people alone." Other humans on the station began volunteering immediately. Ben Carter, a chef who ran a small human restaurant in the station's residential sector, offered his kitchen and his skills. Amy Walsh, an engineer who had been stationed on Nexus 7 for 5 years, volunteered to help with logistics and setup. 3 more human workers stepped forward, eager to participate in what was quickly becoming the biggest human cultural event in the station's history. The plan took shape rapidly, with Ambassador Soren coordinating diplomatic permissions and Chirik handling commercial arrangements and Commander Vex offering her crew's help with setting up the venue. But not everyone was pleased with these developments. As news of the planned event spread across the station, some alien factions began expressing serious concerns. A message arrived from the Velthrani High Council, questioning whether it was safe to expose their citizens to human food. Several Karath trade guilds lodged formal complaints about potential health hazards. And most concerning of all, a Velthrani official named High Curator Morath announced that he would be traveling to Nexus 7 specifically to evaluate whether the event should be permitted to proceed. "Who is High Curator Morath?" Jack asked Ambassador Soren. The ambassador's facial tendrils drooped in what Jack had learned to recognize as concern. "He's one of the most conservative voices on the Velthrani Council," Soren explained. "He has argued for decades that contact with humans poses unacceptable risks to galactic civilization. He will almost certainly try to shut down our event." Jack felt his earlier happiness begin to fade as he realized that his grandmother's chili recipe had somehow become the center of an interstellar political controversy. "So what do we do?" he asked. Lucy put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We prepare the best food we possibly can," she said firmly. "And we show the galaxy that humans have something valuable to offer, something that can bring people together instead of driving them apart." Jack nodded slowly, drawing strength from her confidence. He thought about his grandmother, who had always believed that good food could solve almost any problem. He thought about all the lonely meals he had eaten on this station, surrounded by beings who feared and avoided him. And he thought about Tella and Chirik and Ambassador Soren, who had taken a chance and discovered something wonderful. Maybe this event would fail, and maybe High Curator Morath would shut everything down. But Jack was determined to try, because if there was even a small chance that his grandmother's recipe could help bridge the gap between humans and the rest of the galaxy, then he owed it to her memory to take that chance. "All right," he said, standing up with renewed purpose. "Let us start planning the biggest meal this station has ever seen." 3 station days had passed, and the main dining hall of Nexus 7 had been transformed into something that looked like a festival ground from a dozen different worlds combined into one. Long tables stretched across the entire space, decorated with cloth and flowers and ornaments from Earth alongside similar items from Velthrani and Korath and Drellian cultures. The smells of cooking food filled the air, human dishes mixing with alien cuisine in a complex blend that made the station's air recyclers work harder than they had in years. Jack stood behind one of the main serving stations with Ben Carter and Amy Walsh and 4 other human volunteers, all of them wearing aprons and smiles as they prepared to welcome their guests. They had cooked for 2 days straight, preparing mild versions of foods from around Earth that might appeal to alien palates. There was Italian pasta with gentle tomato sauce, Indian curry adjusted to barely their spice levels, American barbecue with the heat dialed down to almost nothing. Japanese sushi for those who wanted to try raw fish, fresh bread still warm from the oven. And 3 different types of chocolate for dessert. And of course, there was Jack's grandmother's chili, prepared in multiple batches at different spice levels, so every species could find one that suited them. Hundreds of aliens had already gathered outside the hall, waiting for the doors to open, their voices creating a constant buzz of excitement and nervousness. Tella had arrived early with her recording equipment, determined to document every moment of this historic event. Chirrut had brought representatives from 6 different Karth trade guilds, all of them eager to sample human cuisine and discuss business opportunities. Ambassador Soren stood near the entrance in his finest diplomatic robes, ready to welcome visitors and smooth over any conflicts that might arise. Commander Vex had positioned her Drellian crew members throughout the hall to help maintain order and assist anyone who might need medical attention. Everything was ready, but then the main doors opened and High Curator Morth walked in. He was tall even by Veltrani standards, with pale silver skin and facial tendrils that hung perfectly still. And his expression radiated disapproval so intensely that aliens around him actually stepped back to give him space. "This event must not proceed," Morth announced in a voice that carried across the entire hall. "Human food is a biological hazard that poses unacceptable risks to galactic citizens. I am formally requesting that all food service be halted immediately." A ripple of concern passed through the gathered crowd. Ambassador Soren stepped forward to respond, but Jack raised a hand to stop him. "Let me handle this," Jack said quietly, then walked around the serving station to approach the High Curator directly. "High Curator Morth," Jack said respectfully, "I understand your concerns, and I appreciate that you are trying to protect people, but I would like to offer you a different perspective." Morth's tendrils twitched with irritation. "And what perspective could you possibly offer that would change my assessment of the danger your species represents?" Jack reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. "This is bread," he said, unwrapping it to reveal a simple slice of fresh bread with a thin layer of butter. "It is one of the oldest human foods, made from grain that we have cultivated for thousands of years. There are no spices in it, no peppers, nothing that would trigger your sensitive receptors." He tore the slice in half and ate one piece himself, chewing slowly while Morth watched. "Humans share food as an act of trust," Jack continued after swallowing. "When we offer someone a meal, we are saying that we want to connect with them, that we want to understand them and be understood in return. I am not trying to poison your people. I am trying to share something that is precious to me." He held out the remaining half of bread toward the High Curator. "This is not a biological weapon," Jack said softly. "It is an invitation." The entire hall had gone silent, every eye and sensor focused on the human and the Velthrani official. High Curator Morth stared at the bread for a long moment, his tendrils moving in patterns that Jack could not interpret. Then slowly, carefully, he reached out and took the offered food. He raised it to his mouth and took a small bite. The silence stretched on as Morth chewed, his expression unreadable. Then his tendrils began to move in a new pattern, one that Ambassador Soren's gasp suggested was extremely significant. "What is this yellow substance?" Morth asked, his voice much softer than before. "It is called butter," Jack explained. "It comes from animals that we raise and care for on Earth. We have been making it for thousands of years." Morath took another bite, and this time his tendrils were definitely moving in what Ambassador Soren had once described as pleasure. "It carries warmth," Morath said quietly, almost to himself. "Not heat from temperature, but warmth as a flavor. I did not know such a thing was possible." He finished the bread and looked at Jack with eyes that had lost their hostility. "I believe I have misjudged your species," the High Curator admitted. "This is not aggression disguised as nutrition. This is art, This is culture. This is something worth preserving and sharing. He turned to face the crowd. I withdraw my objection, Morth announced formally. Let the first galactic culinary exchange proceed. The cheer that erupted from the gathered aliens was so loud that Jack felt it vibrating through his chest. The event became everything they had hoped for and more. Aliens lined up to try human dishes, their reactions ranging from surprised delight to thoughtful appreciation to outright enthusiasm. In return, they brought forward their own cultural foods, creating an exchange that went both ways. Jack found himself tasting Velthrani nutrient gel, which was bland but interesting, and Korath protein squares, which had a pleasant crunch, and Drellian military rations, which were surprisingly good once you got past the gray color. Tella published her research 3 days later, with her conclusion stating that human food represented edible art, a form of cultural expression that challenges and rewards the consumer simultaneously. Jack's grandmother's chili recipe was formally registered in the Galactic Cultural Archive, the first human dish to receive such an honor. But the moment Jack would remember most came at the end of the event, when the cooking was done and the serving was finished, and he finally had a chance to sit down at one of the long tables. He was not alone anymore. Tella sat to his left, still reviewing her recordings with happy sounds. Chirrut sat to his right, clicking his mandibles in satisfaction. Ambassador Soren and Commander Vex, and even High Curator Morth had all joined the table, along with a dozen other aliens who had started the day as strangers and ended it as friends. Human Jack, Chirrut asked, do you have other recipes to share? Jack smiled and thought about all the dishes his grandmother had taught him, all the meals his family had shared over the years, all the culinary traditions that humanity had developed across thousands of years of history. We have thousands of years' worth of food to share, Jack replied. Then perhaps you could start by telling us about this dish called pizza that you mentioned earlier, Ambassador Soren suggested. Jack laughed and began describing it. The cheese and the sauce and the countless toppings, and the way it brought families together on Friday nights back on Earth. The aliens leaned in with eager curiosity, their fears forgotten, their prejudices melting away. And Jack thought to himself that his grandmother had always said, good food could bring people together. She just never specified that those people had to be human.